Good morning. It is Saturday, June the 15th. This is Ron. Welcome to Story Time. Thank you very much. And that's right. This is Ron, the only true conservative in the United States of America, speaking to the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers. So today I'm reading from Imprimis, the September 2014 issue, and the article is called The History and Danger of Administrative Law by Philip Hamburger from Columbia Law School. I've already read the introduction to this a week or so ago, and now I'm going to be reading the second part of this, which is called The Prerogative Power of Kings. The constitutional history of the past 1,000 years in common law countries records the repeated ebb and flow of absolutism on the one side and law on the other. English kings were widely expected to rule through law. They had parliament for making law and courts of law for adjudicating cases, and they were expected to govern through the acts of these bodies. But kings were discontent with governing through the law and often acted on their own. The personal power that kings exercised when evading the law was called prerogative power. Whereas ordinarily kings bound their subjects through statutes passed by Parliament, when exercising prerogative power, they bound subjects through proclamations or decrees, or what we call today rules or regulations. Whereas ordinarily kings would repeal old statutes by obtaining new statutes, when exercising prerogative power, they issued dispensations and suspensions, or what we call today waivers. Whereas ordinarily kings enforced the law through the courts of law, when exercising prerogative power, they enforced their commands through the prerogative courts. Courts such as the King's Council, the Star Chamber, and the High Commission, or what we today call administrative courts. Ordinarily, English judges resolved legal disputes in accordance with their independent judgment regarding the law. But when kings exercised prerogative power, they expected deference from judges, both to their own decrees and to the holdings and interpretations of their extra-legal prerogative courts. Although England did not have a full separation of powers of the sort written into the American Constitution, it did have a basic division of powers. Parliament had the power to make laws, the law courts had the powers to adjudicate, and the king had the power to exercise force. But when kings acted through prerogative power, they or their prerogative courts exercised all government powers, overriding these divisions. For example, the Star Chamber could make regulations as well as prosecute and adjudicate infractions. And defenders of this sort of prerogative power were not squeamish about describing it as absolute power. Absolutism was their justification. Conceptually, there were three central elements of this absolutism: extra-legal power, supralegal power, and consolidation of power. It was extra-legal, or outside the law, in the sense that it bound the public not through laws or statutes, but through other means. It was supralegal, or above the law, in the sense that kings expected judges to defer to it, notwithstanding their duty to exercise their own independent judgment. And it was consolidated in the sense that it united all government powers, legislative, executive, and judicial, in the king or in his prerogative courts. And underlying these three central elements was the usual conceptual justification for absolute power: necessity. Necessity, it was said, was not bound by law. These claims on behalf of absolutism, of course, did not go unchallenged. When King John called Englishmen to account extra-legally in his council, England's barons demanded in Magna Carta in 1215 that no freeman shall be taken or imprisoned or even summoned except through the mechanisms of law. When 14th century English kings questioned men in the King's Council, Parliament in 1354 and 1368 enacted due process statutes. When King James I attempted to make law through proclamations, judges responded in 1610 with an opinion that royal proclamations were unlawful and void. When James subsequently demanded judicial deference to prerogative interpretations of statutes, the judges refused. Indeed, in 1641, Parliament abolished the Star Chamber and the High Commission, the bodies then engaging in extra-legal lawmaking and adjudication. And most profoundly, English constitutional law began to develop. And it made clear that there could be no extra-legal, supralegal, or consolidated power. All right, that's the end of that section, and next week will be the final section, which is called The Rise of Absolutism in America. And basically, this is an article about the history and the danger of administrative law, and that administrative law has a tendency to be despotic and absolute. So you don't have the checks and balances involved in administrative law that you would have in non-administrative law. So that's the point he's trying to get to here. So next week, like I said, we'll find out about the history of absolutism in America. Right now, when I get back, I'm going to be reading a story from the Sun Stories. Thank you very much. And now I'm going to be reading from the book called Sun Stories, and they're all stories about the sun. And they're from tribal peoples, basically. This one chapter is called Mother Sun and Her People, and it's from the Cherokee Nation in North America. Solstice, like all seasonal change, is actually a gradual transition. Winter sunlight returns slowly, its increase barely perceptible, yet our sense of extremes at solstice time is acute. The solsticean tableau of tiny light born in a huge darkness is a metaphor for a hope and pleasure we feel birthing inside of fear, sadness, and hopelessness. Though we moderns blithely flip electric light switches and frequent the magical cornucopias called supermarkets, our difficult seasonal feelings are oddly strong. They are feelings rooted in an old survival drama in which each winter worry about the return of literal light, food supply, and the continuation of life itself shrouded the village. Modern questions of survival no longer seem so clear-cut, yet the seasonal solstice provokes us in strong uneasiness and mirrors the confusion of every other psychological passage we experience. Psychological passages, in fact, function as psychological solstices. Solstices are times of transition and threshold. They require that we deal with death, change, and limits. The old position is dying, and we must cross to the new. We feel polarized, yet our emotions and options are rarely simply black and white. We tumble across a turbulent palette of physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual color. Ambivalence and aberration tint everything. Today, at the edge of the millennium, we stand in the midst of an ecological and cultural solstice. Our culture must make hard choices about its use of energy. Our supplies of indirect solar energy, oil and coal, are dwindling. Nuclear technology is poisonous. The ways we now use energy deny real limits and endanger health. In order to thrive in the long run, we must accept the dying of our old ways and learn to capture solar energy directly from the sun. We know a lot about how to do that, but despite our current technological savvy, our current personal hows of using solar energy directly, for the most part, for most of our needs, are anything but clear, convenient, and easy. Myths are the maps for our passages, whether they are seasonal, psychological, or eco-cultural. Maps picture routes and destinations at the same time. Maps picture routes and destinations at the same time. There you go. Myths, too, picture complex processes and give us images of wholeness. This Cherokee myth can be read as a story of seasonal and psychological transition. Its subject is of epic proportions. Its style is folksy and humorous, but its comments on no less than the role of death in our lives. The characters in the myth are forced into relationships with limits and death. Mother Sun both causes and experiences death. She stands for arbitrary circumstances and for the struggle to cope. The many opposites in this story finally cluster around a center of integrative acceptance and creativity. The myth also seems to be a story of great cultural transition. In the early 19th century, the lifestyle of the Cherokee Nation was extraordinarily similar to that of their European immigrant neighbors. Unlike many other native tribes, the Cherokee were not nomadic. In fact, their settlements could hardly be distinguished from other farm towns in the state of Georgia. Some Cherokee even owned huge cotton plantations and black slaves. They published their own newspaper. Their government and court systems were nearly identical with those of the United States. They'd even fought with U.S. cavalry against their Creek Indian neighbors. Nonetheless, when gold was discovered on Cherokee territory, Congress gave permission in 1838 for Indian removal. Over a 6-month period, 7,000 U.S. soldiers drove 14,000 Cherokee west from Georgia to Oklahoma over what was later called the Trail of Tears. Drought, extreme cold, measles, and whooping cough struck the marchers. One of every 4 Cherokee died. The story of Mother Sun and her daughter was collected in the 1890s. Though the story may be very old, the teller of this tale was very likely alive, probably an adult at the time of the Trail of Tears. The realities of the Trail of Tears may well have shaped his emphases. The story has motifs in common with many Sun stories, as the story and motif index readily shows. Sun is a woman. Redbird plays a part. A box is a central prop. The dance to attract the Cherokee mother's son from her seclusion is like the spirit dance to attract the Japanese mother's son from her cave. See the storyteller's goddess. And that was the introduction. Excuse me. So this is the story itself. Mother Sun and her people. Mother Sun's face was red. Pacing back and forth, she just gesticulated as she spoke. Moon sat listening, a little slumped, his pale lips pressed together. He looked down sadly at Earth tilting below them. Mother Sun and Moon had this conversation before. Oh, stop mooning, fumed Mother Sun. I feel sorry for them, said Moon. Yeah, well, you can afford to. They look at you like they love you, all soft and smiling. I'm sick of it. Mother Sun, said Moon, they seem ugly to you because you don't realize how hard it is to look at you when you're like this. Like what? I'm just being me, and they squinch up their faces in ugly pouts every time they look at me. They're your grandchildren, said Moon. If they could hear you talk like this, they'd be even more upset. Well, I'm tired of your sniveling, and I've had it with them. They may not be able to hear me, but they're going to feel me, she added grimly. Moon sighed. You're a vindictive old woman, he said, and faded away. Mother's Sun stalked over to her daughter's house for her usual noontime lunch. Mother, said Sun-daughter, what are you doing? Mother's Sun was standing just outside the house, arms raised high, sending down her most ferocious heat to the people below. I'm trying to kill them, she puffed. They're ugly, and they like Moon better than me, and I'm going to punish them. Sun-daughter watched for a little while, then shook her head. I don't know why you can't just let this go. Why do you insist that they act just like you want them to? Mother's Sun paid no attention. She continued to pour on her heat. Sun-daughter's red dress fluttered. Come inside, Mother, she said finally. I've got your favorite yellow squash soup. Mother's Sun, who was tired anyway, allowed herself to be led inside. But seated at the table, she continued to punctuate her rapid chewing with bitter remarks about Moon and the grandchildren. Meanwhile, the people below were falling ill by the hundreds. Afraid and sorrowful, they sent a group of leaders to the little people who live under the world. The opening to the underworld was small, but once inside, so blessedly cool that the heat from the fires of the little people felt comforting. Mother Sun is trying to kill you, the little people explained. You must find a way to kill her instead. We will help. In huge black cauldrons, the little people stirred up the medicine to form 4 poisonous snakes. Send Spreading Adder and Copperhead first, they instructed. If those 2 can't kill her, send the others. Spreading Adder and Copperhead slithered to the top of the sky. Nervously, they coiled beside the Sun-daughter's door. Speaking Adder flicked his tongue while Copperhead practiced his most frightening posture. But when Mother Sun strode into view, having made her journey from the other side of the sky vault, Spreading Adder cowered in her blinding light. All he could do was spit yellow slime. Mother Sun saw only Copperhead. "You nasty old thing," she said, and stepped over him. Ashamed, Spreading Adder and Copperhead slunk away. Then, during the night, Rattlesnake and Water Monster sneaked up to Sundaughter's house. Water Monster's tail covered Moon and the stars with dark clouds. Everyone was sure Water Monster, with his terrible eyes and horns, would assassinate Mother Sun quickly and bring this plague of heat to an end. The two reptiles lurked outside Sundaughter's door. Rattlesnake twitched at every sound, so eager was he to be helpful. "Would you just calm down?" said Water Monster irritably. "She doesn't get here till noon." But Rattlesnake's jumpiness got the better of him. Just before noon, when Sundaughter opened her door to look for her mother, Rattlesnake struck and killed her. "Fool!" shouted Water Monster. "That was the wrong one." In a fury, he churned back to the people below, where he complained and threatened so venomously that the people had to send him to the end of the world, where he remains to this day. Mother Sun found her daughter's body still warm in the doorway. Her jealousy of Moon and her plans for punishing the earth broke to pieces inside her. She gathered her child in her arms. Sundaughter's ghost peeled away from her form and trembled over the wailing mother. Then Sundaughter's spirit flitted away to ghost country in the darkening land in the west. Mother Sun shut herself inside her daughter's house and refused to come out. The people were no longer dying of heat, but now they lived in total darkness. Once more the grandchildren asked the little people for help. "Send 7 men with 7 sticks and a good strong box to Ghost Country," instructed the little people. "Use the sticks to capture Sundaughter in the box and fetch her home. When Mother Sun has her child again, she will shine for you. But whatever you do, whatever she says, don't open that box till she's safe with her mother." For 7 days the 7 men with 7 sticks and a good strong box traveled to Ghost Country. Whirling in the circles of spirits dancing there, the 7 men found Sundaughter in her smoky red dress. Each time she passed, one of the men touched her with his stick. At the 7th touch, Sundaughter rose up out of the ghost dance, and the men folded her into her box. The dance of the ghost people quickened. Carrying the precious box, the 7 men began the journey east, but before long Sundaughter's voice wheedled out of the box. "Please let me out." The men looked at one another but did not answer. "I'm so hungry," Sundaughter said pitifully. "I can't breathe in here," she moaned. "I'm dying." The men felt afraid. Suppose she did die and they were not able to bring her alive to her mother? The people might send them, as they had Water Monster, to the end of the world. The men shrugged helplessly. They opened the box a tiny crack. With a fluttering, something flew past them. A bright red bird lit on a nearby bush. Frightened, the men opened the box all the way. Sundaughter was gone. But in her new form of red bird, she began to warble a song. In great dismay, the men tried to catch her, but Sundaughter, forever red bird now, took wing. If only the men had kept the box closed, we would always have been able to bring back the people we love from the ghost country. But alas, it isn't so. The men shut the lid on the empty box and forced themselves to return to the settlements. Mother Sun screamed when she opened the box. When she'd heard of the 7 men's journey, she had clung to the hope that she might be able to see her child again. Now she understood that her daughter would never come back. She wept tears that flooded the entire world. In hopes of saving themselves from the drowning darkness, the people held council. They sent up a group of children to drum and dance for Mother Sun. Clinging to one another's hands, the youngsters danced the most winning dance they could. Mother Sun, however, seemed to pay no attention. All was dark, wet, and freezing cold. Then, without warning, the drummers changed their beat. The dancers dropped their hands, and each began a separate leaping and twirling, faster and faster. The quickened rhythm was so exciting that Mother Sun stopped crying and could not help herself from peeking. When they saw her face, the dancers rippled into a rainbow of joy. Mother Sun's eyes filled again with tears, but this time she did not spill them. She gazed at her dancing and singing grandchildren. How alive they were, and not ugly at all. Mother Sun smiled tremulously and opened the door. Stepping outside, she very gently raised her arms. And that is the conclusion of the Sun story number one, called Mother Sun and Her People from uh, the Cherokee Nation. And next week we'll be reading how Shabash the Sun rescued the Prince of Fertility from ancient Canaan, Canaan. So, but anyways, I'm reading that because to illustrate also the difference. I read from the Anglican Theological Review, which is highly conceptual and abstract, and has a beauty, a certain beauty to it. These stories also have a certain beauty to them, but it's also to illustrate the difference between being a society in which you communicate chiefly by telling stories and or painting verbal pictures, and being a society that communicates conceptually and abstractly. So, on that note, we've concluded another episode of Story Time. And until next time, thank you very much for joining me, and have a great day.